Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where we will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain to get the kind of healthy, loving relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm your host, licensed therapist, Dr. Natalie Jones. Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm super excited to be back with you guys. Have a great show planned for you all. I have attorney Sam Dordulian back. He was on last week or the last episode, and so he's back, and we have a very special show planned for you guys today. So stay right there. Hello and welcome to the show, Sam.
Thank you for having me again.
You're quite welcome. So for anyone who's listening to this show for the first time, or maybe didn't hear your first episode, could you tell us a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, and the passion behind your work?
Absolutely. My name is Sam Dordulian. I'm an attorney. I own my own law practice. It's called the Dordulian Law Group. As a way of background, I was a former prosecutor with LA County District Attorney's Office for 13 years. Half of my career I spent in our sex crimes division. It's where we would handle the more significant sexual assault crimes in LA County. I did that, like I said, for almost half my career. Saw pretty much everything you can possibly imagine under the sun, prosecuted everything from child sexual abuse to adult rape, serial rapists. And after leaving the district attorney's office, I started my own practice. I brought all those skills and knowledge that I learned as a prosecutor to the civil arena. I continue to represent survivors of sexual abuse in my practice, made that a focus of my practice. And I brought in a lot of elements that I saw was clearly something that survivors need. A lot of support, not just the legal, not just the attorney mind. I have an investigator that is a former LAPD sex crimes detective of over 20 years. He knows exactly how to deal with survivors of sexual abuse. He's our in-house investigator. My staff that deals with survivors of sexual abuse are all trained as advocates for survivors of sexual abuse. They're trauma informed. And, it helps to have my wife, who is a licensed clinical social worker, who also deals within this space and is there to help us, provide resources for our clients for counseling and support and whatever else that they may need while they go on this journey of healing through the legal system, which unfortunately isn't necessarily a kind road oftentimes, but it's one that we can, provide some support, not just from the legal perspective, but also the psychological perspective.
Oh, I love it. That's so awesome. And so, is this, just to be clear, do you feel like your field or your line of work, is it common to have attorneys that do your line of work?
No, it's actually kind of rare. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, what I have seen, and this is somewhat recent, is a lot of law firms that just practice in general personal injury law are jumping into this space. And the reason they're jumping into the space is quite unfortunate because there's a lot of headlines recently about juvenile sexual abuse cases, which my
Yes.
office does handle. But there's another firm that's known for personal injury that jumped into this and got a lot of bad press because of peers that, there's some allegations that some of the people that they were representing were fraudulent. And now there was a lot of settlements and a lot of big numbers that were thrown around, and I'm starting to see other law firms seeing those numbers, thinking, well, this is easy, let's just jump in and do it. But what a lot of these firms don't realize, this is not the same thing as a regular personal injury practice. This is not a car accident case, and it has a lot of nuances to it that someone who doesn't practice in this space wouldn't know and wouldn't know how to handle the kind of situations that survivors sometimes would expect. And I think that's kind of a disservice to the survivors that so many of these firms who don't have the background, who haven't invested the time to get some of the training and get trauma informed, to then just jump in the space thinking, well, I can litigate a car accident and I should be able to litigate this sexual assault case. And it's not, unfortunately, the same thing.
So what, as we have a lot of survivors that listen to the show, what, and maybe I should have done this last time, what should survivors look for, like, when they come to a law firm, they have a sexual abuse or a sexual assault case or something like that, and they're thinking about taking the legal route?
Well, obviously, someone with experience in this field and significant experience, not because they just did one case, 6 weeks ago or 6 months ago, but someone who understands what survivors of sexual abuse go through, someone who understands what a lot of the people and a lot of the jurors that I face in these kind of trials don't understand is normal. For example, not reporting. It's actually more common not to get an immediate report to law enforcement from sexual assault than to actually get one. And you need people who understand this and understand the reasons why this is considered normal. So having someone who has a lot of experience dealing with sexual abuse survivors and has dealt with these issues and understands what is considered normal and not normal and is trauma informed. So asking all those questions about their background, their experience, whether they have any training in being trauma informed, and how many of these cases they've handled in their past. I've been in this space for 25 years. So like I said, especially when you're in a big office like the LA County District Attorney's Office,
Yes.
you see pretty much everything that you can possibly
Yeah.
see in the 6+ years that I was in the sex crimes division. So you need that kind of immersion to really understand when a survivor explains something to you, that it
Yeah.
makes sense because of all the other cases that you've done and you've seen that pattern repeat itself over and over again.
I like that. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. And are there questions that people should ask the attorney to kind of vet out some of what you're saying? Like, is there a way that they can ask questions without like the attorney being offended, or just sort of vetting even the
I think
website or something? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you should be concerned about offending the attorney, because if the attorney's offended by you asking questions about their background
Yeah.
and qualifications, and maybe that's not an attorney for you. So
Good.
ask away, and I encourage everyone to ask away because you need to know the experience of the attorney that you're handling. I think there's two parts that you need to inquire about. One is their particular experience dealing with sexual abuse cases. What is their background? What training do they have in being trauma informed? How many cases of sexual assault have they handled? Um, that's one aspect. The second aspect is making sure that they're true litigators. There's a lot of attorneys that will advertise about handling, all sorts of cases. The question is, how many cases have they actually gone to trial? You need to ask that question, because at the end of the day, if your attorney that you're hiring doesn't have the trial experience, I can
I
guarantee
would
the other
agree.
side knows about it and will
Yeah.
probably take advantage of it. You need
Yeah.
someone who's been to court and knows how to try a case. Combination of being a prosecutor and a civil attorney in the 25 years in this space, I've done well over 100. I don't know if it's 120 now. I don't know the number, but it's well over 100 jury trials.
Yeah.
And you need someone with that kind of background and experience who, one, isn't afraid to go to trial, but two, really understands what the sexual abuse survivor needs, with regard to whether we should pursue litigation or pursue some other avenue of settlement, and understands this, the survivor.
I love it. Thank you. So, well, thank you so much for educating people. And I think that's a good like segue into our next piece, right? Because today we're really going to be taking a deep dive into child on child sexual assault. And I think it's good to start with like, maybe more of a like a definition or what could be considered, because I think that can get gray for a lot of people.
Yeah, because I think, and I'll be honest with you, this kind of caught me a little by surprise too. The amount of cases that I'm seeing,
Yeah.
especially lately. But generally speaking, I think most of us, when we think of childhood sexual abuse, we think of an adult abusing a child. And that, in my experience, especially as a prosecutor, is what I normally did see as well. I did work in our juvenile division, and I did see some child on child, but there was a lot of those cases involve teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't see a lot of child on child involving much younger
Mm-hmm.
kids. So we are trained, I guess, to believe, watching TV, that it's usually that stranger that will, weird person that will attack your child and commit some sort of childhood sexual abuse. What we know is that's actually not true. It's usually not a stranger. It's usually a trusted person, whether that's their school teacher, a police officer, your doctor, your priest, your pastor, but somebody that that child knows and over time has grown to trust. But what I'm experiencing now, and this child on a child, is something completely different. Uh, I started getting calls, I would say maybe about 2 years ago, and it just seems to be cascading. The more cases that I take, the more I've seemed to be getting calls on. And what I'm seeing is a lot of children, especially in a school setting, where they're committing sexual assaults on each other. And that takes the gamut of, children going into the bathroom and experimenting with oral sex, uh, children holding each other down and committing forcible sexual assault. But the most shocking part for me was seeing how young some of these kids were. I actually have cases that I filed in school settings where I have 4 and 5 year olds
Yep.
going around and committing sexual assault. There's one case where
Yeah.
this young boy, I think he was 5, committed sexual assault on 7 children in that
Yeah.
school.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them involving forcibly holding them down while he puts his hand underneath their clothes and touches all the genitals and, make does conduct that would be shocking to hear that a 4 or 5 year old are engaged in. But I'm seeing that happen over and over again, public schools, private schools, and there's just a lot of that occurring. It seems to be, and I don't know, I hate to say the word trend, but it seems to be something that's occurring a lot. And I think people need to be aware of it and pay attention to it. And realize that that is something that can occur in your schools. And please ask a lot of questions of your teachers about their policies of how they watch these children, particularly the very young children, need to be monitored the whole time that they're there
Yep.
because of their age. But this
Mm-hmm.
is happening. It's happening in our schools.
I agree. I think the youngest that I have seen has been a 2-year-old. It's something that's very, very commonly happens sometimes in domestic violence shelters, when women, come with their children and then they kind of group the children together. I'm curious, do you feel like this is something that like there's an increase in, or do you think people are just becoming more aware of
That's a
what it
very good
is? Yeah.
question. I,
Yeah.
I tend to think, just because I've been in this space for 25 years, that I'm seeing it so much more lately. I spoke with my investigator, who again has been with LAPD Sex Crimes Division. In fact, he was in charge of the juvenile sexual abuse cases for many,
Yeah.
many years. I asked him if he noticed whether that was something new, or we're just starting to put names to it and calling it out.
Mm.
And he said that he's actually noticed probably an increase in the last 10 years in
Yeah.
his experience, but there seems to be an increased number of these calls being made. um, So I don't know. And I don't know what the cause is. I don't know if there's some play with social media and the exposure that kids are getting to a lot of these things. I don't really know what's prompting this, but I do know in my own practice in the last several years, I've been getting a lot more calls from parents whose
Interesting.
children were abused, usually in the school setting, and again, involving sometimes some very young children.
Interesting, because the one thing I was wondering about is social media, but also like pornography is easily accessible now. Like so porn you
Right.
could have it on like iPads and stuff. So if you're an iPad kid, versus back in the day, it was VHS or you had to go out and buy it, but now it's like it's free and it's downloadable and accessible. So I wonder about that too. So, and I don't know if you have some ideas, based on the cases that you're seeing, like where are these kids learning from, or where are they like picking up things from? Do you have any like data or just information around that for yourself or what you've seen or heard?
No, and that's the big question I think we need to start asking and trying to figure out. Because a lot of these cases are just sometimes swept under the rug, and even adults, those in charge, just say, well, this is just normal childhood curiosity. Well, the kind of conduct that I'm seeing is not normal, and it's not normal childhood curiosity, especially when a child is holding another child down with screaming and forcibly sticking their hands
Well,
underneath their clothes. That's not normal childhood
that
curiosity.
is
And for
not.
yeah, and for an adult, and this is what I have in one of my cases, the school administrator labeled that as just normal childhood curiosity, and doing that I think is a disservice because we're not making any attempt to figure out why this child is doing that act. I'm sure being in this space as well, the first thought that we all have is maybe that child is also a victim and being abused, and that's where they're learning it
Mhm.
from because we've seen that in the past. So the first thing that I think needs to be done by adults, those who are responsible, law enforcement and child protective services, is to do an investigation to find out that child who's being accused of doing all this inappropriate things, are they themselves victims of childhood sexual abuse?
Mhm.
That needs
Mhm.
to be done. But the more we blow it off, especially the schools that I've seen that seem to want to take the
Yes.
defensive and put their reputation first over the well-being of this child and try not to do an investigation, I think is doing a disservice to everybody, not only to the victims, but also that child who's doing this act clearly learned it from somewhere. We need to figure out where that is because, they could be a victim themselves.
I agree with you there. And, I'm just thinking like, yeah, there have been like some increases in violent. I was thinking about the little girl earlier this year where I don't know, it was like boys from school or something like that held her down and just really sort of messed her up where they were using objects such as sticks and things like that. It was a little black girl, and I think it was like a neighborhood full of white kids, if I recall correctly. And I'm just curious, like, too, for you, have you seen like particular demographics, like, in terms of uptick? Is it like specific ages, specific demographics? Like what's your take on that?
So it's interesting you asked that because it's to me, the more I look at my own cases that I'm getting calls on, it seems to be so widespread that I'm not seeing necessarily a pattern. I'm seeing cases being parents calling from public schools. I
Mhm.
have now multiple cases from very prestigious private schools, and you're talking about, all sorts of demographics, whether it's African American, white, and a mixture of all of those other type of kids. So I'm not seeing necessarily a pattern, but I'm seeing it so widespread.
Interesting.
Again, I'm seeing children way too young to know and have knowledge of sexual conduct doing these kind of things. And then the big question is, where are they learning this from? How are they
Uh,
getting this information?
I would agree. And, in terms of like, what are you seeing in terms of like, you know, familiarity? Are these mostly happening at schools, or is this mostly happening within the family? church or some other sort of community organizations? What are you seeing in terms of like the relation or the connection of the victim
I'm
and the, yeah.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of school cases, a lot of school cases. And there's a mixture of both the sexual assault and bullying that occurs. In a lot of my cases, it
Mm-hmm.
is the combination of the two. In fact, a lot of the cases that I'm getting, it starts off with some bullying, the parents complaining to the school, this particular child is bullying my child. And, again, little to nothing is done. Next thing you know, the conduct escalates and now it
Mm-hmm.
involves sexual assault. So I see the interplay between bullying and sexual abuse in these kind of cases, but predominantly I'm seeing it in the school setting. And again, it literally it's across the board. And it's not just, some poor school district, public school, but
Yeah.
most expensive private schools in LA. I have cases from those particular schools as well. So it literally is all over the place.
And just for reference, because I know that some schools can be like all girls or all boys schools. Are you seeing it there as well?
I have not seen in any school where it's all boys or all girls. All the
Okay.
cases that I've been getting have been where it's mixed gender.
Okay. Okay. So, um, like, what should be considered assault from another child?
So that's a good question. And this is where I
Yeah.
think is my frustration with school administrators, because if you look at the legal definition, you're never going to have a child, especially 4 or 5, who's ever going to get charged with the crime. Because again, as a former prosecutor, you did this type of stuff. Uh, from the criminal perspective, you need what they call mens rea in the criminal law, which is the ability to form that mental intent. So the criminal law requires if you're going to charge someone with some sort of sexual assault or sexual abuse, you need them to form that intent to commit a sexual act. And it'd be almost impossible, especially if you put up any expert to say that, a child who's 4 or 5 really truly understands that. They're clearly learning it from somewhere, but they don't really understand anything related to sexual relations and what the conduct is, and much
Mm.
less being able to prove that they have formed that intent to commit this as a sexual act versus them just acting out without really even understanding what they're necessarily doing. So, from the criminal perspective, on these cases, I've had where the parents have called the police and the police just simply can't do anything. They'll never charge that 4 year old, that
Wow.
5 year old, that 8 year old, or that 9 year old. What they will do, or what they should be doing, is call in Child Protective Services for the Child Protective Services to do an investigation to find out what's going on, make sure that that won't happen again, and there's not that connection between the perpetrator and that child, but also to make sure that that perpetrator, that child who's also the perpetrator who's also a child, is not being abused somewhere else and
Yeah.
learning that conduct from being a victim of childhood sexual abuse themselves. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done once this is reported and authorities need to get involved, but there will not be any type of criminal charge against this child. And that's what the schools end up using as their shield. Police will tell them, well, there's no sexual assault here from the criminal perspective. And the schools will turn around and tell the parent, well, this was investigated. There was no sexual assault. Well, from a criminal perspective, that might be
Mm.
true, but that doesn't mean that child didn't experience a sexual assault. They did. And the school clearly didn't do enough to protect that child from experiencing that. And they use that as a shield. And that's the frustrating part for me. Parents need
Mm.
to understand that, yes, criminally, nothing will be done to that child. Whether you like that or don't like that, that's the reality. But that doesn't mean that there aren't remedies in the civil arena.
Okay.
So you hold the school responsible for failing to monitor 4 and 5 year olds. How does a child touch 7 different children over a period of time and no school administrator sees what's happening and their
Yeah.
4 and 5 year olds? Shouldn't they be monitored at all times at that tender age? They need to be always monitored because of their age. And there are, remedies. There are things that can be done in the civil arena that can't be done in the criminal arena. And because the police investigate and don't charge anyone and say that there's no sexual assault from their perspective, that doesn't mean the case ends. But that's how the schools will use it. They use it as a shield. They hold it up and say the police investigated and there's no sexual assault. And that's just
Interesting.
wrong.
Is that like in terms of like what you're finding in schools, are you finding that like this is happening in schools where maybe they don't have enough staff or staff is just inattentive or what are you finding in terms of the school situation?
I think it's a combination of a lot of those things that you mentioned. Lack of staff, inattention, and just I think lack of understanding and knowledge that these things can occur and do occur. I think a lot of times, sometimes teachers will blow it off when a child does even complain. Oh yeah, little Johnny is just being naughty. I'll tell him not to be naughty. Well, it's going to take a little bit more than telling little Johnny not to be naughty. You have children and have cases where a child will take another child into the bathroom and perform oral sex. Well, that's not just being naughty. There's
Yeah.
something that school needs to be doing to monitor very young children entering into the bathroom. I know that's a delicate issue because, you have to balance privacy rights with, being able to monitor young children. But there are ways that schools can do that. And I know there's some policies, including with the largest LAUSD, who has looked into this issue as far as bathroom policies of very young children in third grade or younger. But there's one thing to have a policy, another thing to have teachers who are completely unaware of that home policy and following the policy, which have found that a lot of them don't follow their own internal policies. Sometimes they don't even know about it as far as how to monitor these children and the need to
Mm-hmm.
monitor these children,
Mm-hmm.
including in settings such as bathrooms, where oftentimes it's used to commit these acts because there are no adults around.
What are like, I'm just kind of also curious too about like when this occurs in the family.
Well, that's what, and as a prosecutor, seeing a lot of these child sexual assault cases, you see that a lot where the child is being abused at home and then will lash out on other children at school or somewhere else where they will have access to other children. So you do see that, which is why I'm very passionate about law enforcement and child protective services getting involved in doing their jobs to properly investigate all of these claims, which sometimes, at least in my experience, I don't think is being done. I think a lot of people just kind of wash their hands. They're just young children. They're just curious. They're just messing around. Little Johnny's just being naughty. And it's beyond that. You're having conduct of children who are doing these horrible things to each other. And these will have very lasting effects on these kids. And we as adults have to do something about
Mhm.
it. And we can't just keep blowing it off. And if there is any type of abuse at home, obviously that's where law enforcement needs to really step up and do their investigation. If that's happening, protect that child as well. I mean, it appears that they're perpetrating some conduct at school, but they're also victims themselves and they need services, which is why, again, I'm very passionate that when any of these things are made, child protective services and law enforcement need to do a thorough investigation as to where that conduct began. Where did this child learn this? Was it on the internet? Was it access to porn? Was it social media? Were they being abused at home? All these questions need to be asked and thoroughly investigated.
Awesome. When should parents involve, or when should people involve child protective services and law enforcement? Uh-oh.
Right away, immediately. As
Okay.
soon as your child makes any complaint or you find out that there's some sort of inappropriate conduct that's occurring at the school, immediately make a report. Don't rely on the schools to do that. School teachers are mandated reporters. They're mandated to make these
Yes, they
reports
are.
when there's any suspicions of child sexual abuse. But you can't rely on the schools doing that call yourself if you're a parent. Make sure that the police are informed and Child Protective Services are also informed, because one or the other has to do that investigation. And again, when you have very young children, you're going to have the police kind of do a hands-off approach, which honestly isn't even within policy. Again, having my investigator as a former LAPD detective in sex crimes, he himself was integral in creating that policy in the juvenile division, where they were required to investigate to determine if the child himself is or herself is being victimized at home or somewhere else. But I've seen where even LAPD doesn't follow their own internal policies and do a thorough investigation. So call law enforcement, your local law enforcement, whoever they may be, call Child Protective Services. Make sure a report is generated, a case number is created, so somebody will be looking into this to determine whether further conduct or investigation needs to be done.
Thank you. Is there, the other aspect I wonder about is like, CPS dropping. Can you hear me?
Dr. Jones, you're cutting out.
Oh
Yeah,
no. We had this last time. Oh
yeah, we
no.
did, and we were fine up until now, but
I
right now
know, right?
I'm
Like
getting a
right when we
warning
get to
saying network bandwidth is low.
Okay, so you're getting, I think it's Zoom. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's this
Yeah.
hour. Um, I was gonna say, like, is there, like, have you seen it
Oh, you're
where,
frozen.
uh-oh, uh-oh. What about now? Let me see.
Um, Still cutting
Okay. It
in and
is.
out.
Okay. It says I'm connected, so I'm not sure why I'm cutting out. Let's see.
Yeah, same here. And we're on supposed to be fiber, which is supposed to be the best
Yeah.
and the highest. So I don't know.
Yeah. It's so
So
weird.
I don't know.
Wonder if it
I'm
has
hearing you
anything to do.
now, but it's still.
Okay. It's funny. I wonder if it has anything to do with the subject matter.
Even the
Yeah.
internet
Okay.
is just not handling this
It's
well.
not. It's not handling it well. It's trying to shut it down. Let's see. Okay. How about now? Is this any better? No?
It
Yes,
comes
no.
and goes, but right now I'm able to hear you. Yeah, let's see.
Okay.
Hopefully it'll stay.
Let's see what happens. What I was gonna ask is like, like is in any part of child on child sexual assault cases, is any part of it like exacerbated by CPS dropping the ball?
Uh, yes, I think a lot of those times, a lot of these investigations in the very beginning, they're considered confidential. I don't get access. If we file a lawsuit, we'll be able to subpoena and try to get some of this information to see what they did. But that's unfortunately, many months, if not years later, that we get that information. But what I tell parents is you're the one right now that CPS will be talking to because it's your child and you have a right to certain information. So I encourage the parents to be the one calling CPS, asking questions, finding out who they talked to, what investigation that they did. Some CPS personnel will share some certain bit of information. Others will not be as forthcoming. But I think it's up to the parents to really be pushing and asking a lot of questions and demanding certain answers. And sometimes you'll be told, well, we did our investigation and we closed the case. And that's maybe all you will get told. And you won't have much more information. That sometimes I have found that parents will be given some further information as to, we talked to this person and that person. At least you know that they're doing something. So yes, to answer your general question, I have seen that even CPS, who should be trained in this field, who should understand what is considered normal and abnormal conduct by the children, unfortunately, sometimes not doing their job properly either.
Is there any legal recourse for that?
there is, if they are negligent in their conduct and it leads to additional harm, there is recourse, assuming again that their negligence and their failure to properly investigate and protect the child leads to further harm in the child. But after the harm has been created and the child is not protected by the parent and not exposed to that harm again, even if CPS drops the ball at that point, it probably is not much of a civil recourse because
Yeah.
they're not subjected to additional harm. Just their ineffectiveness is itself the basis for a lawsuit.
Okay. And when should parents or guardians come to see somebody like you in all of this?
Sadly, it seems like we're the only ones that can do anything because, again, the
Um,
police hands are tied because there's no way of proving mens rea of a 4 or 5 year old. Civil action is probably the only way you're going to hold somebody accountable for the failure to monitor these children, and that is the schools. So calling us, I think sooner than later helps because we can guide you through what needs to be done, who to report to, how to report to the people, what to look for, what to expect, what questions to ask. So coming to us right away will help get that process started, preserving the evidence, obviously, and most importantly, dealing with the therapy aspect, making sure the kids are getting the appropriate care that they need. I'm a little bit of a skeptical of allowing a parent to allow the school that, failed to protect this child to provide the therapy for that child. Maybe I'm overly skeptical on this issue, but I always advise parents, find therapy outside of the school.
okay.
Sometimes the school will offer you that, but what they should not have is access to all the private conversations of the child and the therapist. And if they're paying for it and they're finding these therapists and handling it, I just have a fear that they probably are getting reports from the therapist when they shouldn't. And finding information about what the child is saying when they shouldn't, because that should all be confidential. For that reason, I always tell parents, even if the school offers you the therapy, try to seek the therapy outside because there's a lot of good resources for parents, including free resources for survivors of sexual abuse. There's a lot of centers that do a lot of good out there. There's a lot of women's centers, Peace Over Violence, a lot of places that provide these kind of services for sexual abuse survivors without charge.
Okay. And when people come to see you, is there a statute of limitations for when they could kind of, you know, take
So
legal
with
action?
childhood Yeah, with
Yeah.
childhood sexual abuse, the good thing is while they're a minor, the statute doesn't run. So technically, the child who's being abused when they're under the age of 18 can technically wait till they're before the age of 40 to file. So that's many, many, many years. Um, and and we know that a lot of times children won't report for a lot of reasons and understandable reasons. And sometimes the reporting will come out many years later. But if there is reporting when it's happening or early on, I think it's best to try to immediately deal with that situation because you can preserve so much more evidence. You can go out and do an investigation and have witnesses talk to and have the various school officials, teachers, and the aides and get statements right away as opposed to waiting many, many years when then they will leave the system, they'll be gone, it'll be hard to
Yeah.
find, and getting statements and confirmation and witness statements become much more difficult.
Okay, fair enough. And for parents that are listening to you, and I know there's probably a lot of people that listen and they've seen something and or something has occurred, but they're worried about getting any aspect of the system involved. Uh, that maybe they're worried about getting in trouble or something like that. What do you have to say to that?
Well, and this comes up a lot in situations where the parents are in a private school and they're afraid, okay, if I make waves, they're going to, kick us out. And I want my child to go to this very prestigious school. I've had that conversation with parents, and they've had other children who are also in the school. They're afraid if they make waves with this one child, the other child is going to get kicked out. And sadly, that does happen. I have seen where the school will retaliate and kick out the
Mm-hmm.
kids who are making these reports. And
Mm-hmm.
I have honest discussions and frank discussions with my parents about, you should definitely talk this through with other professionals. You have your child in therapy and talk to the therapist and see what's best for the child as far as whether we should go forward with litigation or shouldn't. And, amongst themselves, amongst the parents, they need to discuss whether they're prepared to not go to this school anymore or prepared to have their other child be kicked out of
Yeah.
that school, because these are things that I have seen occur on
Okay.
way more than one occasion. So retaliation is real. Schools will retaliate, and I've seen it more, unfortunately, in the private school sector than I have seen in public schools, where there will be some form of retaliation in school when you do make waves, when you make a claim, when you do ask questions. And is that automatic defensive mechanisms that school officials will put up, and whether it's reputation, their own personal reputation, the school's reputation, I don't know, but they get very defensive, and it's no longer about what's the best interest of the child. It's about what the best interest of the school is, and sometimes that conflicts with what's in the best interest of the child.
Okay. And what about like, jail or removal of their child from their home?
And I guess there are parents who are also afraid of, getting child protective services
Yeah.
involved. They need to be aware, and I always inform the parents that there will be an investigation in child protective services. Once they begin investigation, we'll be talking to you, and they'll be asking questions to you as well. But, for the most part, parents shouldn't be afraid of that process. It is part of the process to be investigated and to have questions asked. But for the most part, there's nothing that's going to come out of that situation unless there's something to be afraid of at home, which, at least in the cases that I'm seeing, the parents, there's nothing for them to be afraid of, and the
Yeah.
investigation doesn't cause any harm internally within their structure. It is part of the process, but it's not something that they should be.
Absolutely. Thank you. And there's a couple things that I'm thinking of, or a couple questions I should say I'm thinking of. And I'm just kind of curious how you may handle this or what, advice or feedback you have on something like this. What about if a child is like special needs or nonverbal or maybe even just too young to understand? So they're not able to respond to like a traditional interview or show me what happened or tell me what happened. What's your advice to, children or parents of children who've experienced this, but maybe they can't communicate the way that you or I could?
Those are painfully difficult cases, and I
Yeah.
have had calls similar to what you're describing. And it's very, very difficult. And my heart goes out to those parents, because what makes it very difficult is for any type of litigation process, whether it's criminal or civil, there has to be some level of proof that will be sufficient in a court of law. When a child is nonverbal or has some difficulty with expressing themselves and can't communicate what actually happened or provide the details, then you need some other form of corroboration, whether that's another witness, whether that's a camera that captured certain things. And when you don't have that, it makes it almost impossible for us to be able to help those families. I've had
Mm.
parents who have nonverbal children who tell me that they know their child is acting very differently and they're trying to communicate to them in their own special way. It may not be the way we communicate, but they understand. The parents tells me they understand the child is asking for help, but that's not something that can be easily put on in a court of law. It can't just be the mom saying, I know this is what my child is saying, even though they're not
Mhm.
saying it. It's certain clues that I'm picking up. It's not going to translate to evidence in a court of law that's going to be sufficient for us to move forward. And that's the difficult part. So these are those, that demographic you brought up, incredibly vulnerable children. And that vulnerability, unfortunately, is what these perpetrators sometimes look for, particularly the adult perpetrators, and take advantage of that situation. And that's very, very difficult. The police will, especially involved as an adult, will thoroughly investigate that. They'll look for witnesses, they'll look for cameras, they'll look for some way
Yeah.
corroborating that this event occurred. Sometimes even, speaking to the perpetrator and seeing if they would admit to certain questions or certain conduct. So I
Wow.
would advise parents to get the authorities involved in that situation, but it is painfully difficult because unless there's corroboration, there's sadly very little that we can do to help.
Are there situations where maybe the cart came before the horse? Like, for example, the child is exhibiting sexual symptoms, and then maybe people have to kind of work backwards to see what is happening at the schools or elsewhere. Have you encountered that? And like, what's or like, what should people look for if that's the case?
Yeah, and we've had situations like that where the parents are looking and finding that their children are acting differently. They're doing things that they haven't done before. Bedwetting is one of the more common repercussions or ramifications of some form of sexual abuse.
Yeah.
And when a child who wasn't bedwetting also now starts regressing and starting to bedwet, that's potential indicator. Not saying that your child is sexually abused if they start bedwetting again, but that is something to ask questions of why they're doing it. What kind of stress is in their lives that's causing them to experience that. Um, Sexual conduct of a child itself is an indicator. So
Mm,
parents will start noticing things, will start asking questions, and we have to work backwards, which is again why, you know, uh, I'm an advocate of informing the authorities, but I'm also quite aware that sometimes they just don't do enough to thoroughly
yeah.
investigate what's going on. But that's our best option or best effort to try to figure out what is going on with that child. Um, what you can't do is immediately force that child to start talking because they have to feel safe and they have to feel comfortable. And unless the child feels safe and comfortable, they won't disclose to the parents. And the biggest thing that I see, and having done this in the number of years that I've done it, is the children themselves, they're afraid that they're the ones who are going to get in trouble if they do tell.
Mm,
And it's that fear that prevents a child from saying anything. And until they're comfortable, and what you will find, Elise, is children will give you little bits. They'll test you out. They'll mention one thing and see how you react to that. And if you don't react properly as a parent, they might shut down and not give you anything more. So they have to feel safe. They have to feel comfortable. Maybe, if you are suspecting something, take them to a professional who deals with children and make sure that therapist has experience dealing with child with sexual abuse. Because just like with the legal practice, if you don't really know the nuances of that, you're not going to be as efficient and as effective. And the same with therapy as well.
mm,
Can't just take them to some random therapist, someone who has experience dealing with child with sexual abuse that can make the child feel safe and make the child understand they themselves are not in trouble for
yeah.
anything and to feel safe enough to tell what's going on. And that I have found to be sometimes a lengthy process. But if you do those steps and take the proper steps, you may find out, sadly, many months later, and the child may finally disclose what's going on, and you can work backwards
Yeah.
and get corroboration for that event.
That's awesome. And I'm curious, like, how if you've ever encountered anyone who's made a child that's made a false allegation, or even, if you've had experience with a child being accused of making false allegations, and not necessarily from the person per se that they're accusing, but just like, I don't know, like their community and things of that nature.
So it depends on the age of the child. And I
Yeah.
think one of the things that most people don't appreciate is there have been studies on this, the significant studies, on the suggestibility of children in making false sexual assault
Yeah.
accusations. And most of the studies, and I've reviewed a lot of them personally, most of the studies have shown because the younger children don't even understand what sexual act is, what sexual conduct is. It's very difficult for them to make these false accusations. Um, Now, mind you, most of these studies were done well before the access and the open access the kids have to the internet. So I don't know if any of that might change a little bit, but the studies that I've seen basically have shown that children under the age, I think it was 9, if I remember correctly, it's very difficult for anybody to suggest anything to a child and for them to make up a sexual abuse allegation. In fact, the studies have shown they did some studies where they walked into a classroom. Obviously, they're not going to commit a sexual assault and see if the child discloses it, but they will touch a child on a certain body part, maybe a shoulder, maybe on the back of the neck, and they will then ask a child if this random stranger that walked in and touched them did touch them. And most children will even deny being touched, even innocent touches of the shoulder or on their leg, because they were just afraid of what that may mean about what they did, or maybe they allowed it to happen. And children were very, very hesitant to
Yeah.
even admit innocent touching, much less something much more intimate. So most of the studies do show that younger children, it's very unlikely for them to make it up because they just don't understand what normal sexual conduct is. Now, as you get older, there is the propensity, that especially if there's any type of suggestion, you see it a lot in the divorce setting when there's child custody issues and there's divorce and there's childhood abuse accommodation syndrome where there's the suggestibility of one parent against the other, and you see that in that
Yes.
context. But
Yes.
for the younger children, for the most part, it's not very likely. If your child tells you and they're under, you know, tender ages and they're 5, 6, 7, 8, they're very unlikely that they're making any of this up. So I would strongly encourage the parents to believe their children, get help, seek help, and find out what's going on.
Okay. And I would agree there. In terms of informing law enforcement, and things like that, should they also automatically take their children to the hospital or ER or
It's not a bad
doctor?
idea to,
Yeah.
yeah, get your doctor as well, get them checked out.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that your child is going to disclose to your doctor because there's probably not that close of a relationship between the pediatrician and the child. But I think getting a physical exam is a very good idea because occasionally you will find some physical evidence on the child corroborating the
Mm.
claim of some form of touching. And so if there was particularly any type of penetrative touching, there can be physical evidence that doctors will be able to document. So getting your child examined, I think is a very, very helpful suggestion.
Awesome. And then, you spoke about criminal intent. Thank you for answering that. You spoke about criminal intent, being able to prove that. What does that look like?
Well, that's the hard part. For children, we don't know what that looks like. And nobody's able to be able to say that children have the ability to understand and are
Mm,
conducting the acts that they're doing is to further their own sexual desires. Because you don't imagine a 4-year-old having a sexual desire. They don't have the
yeah,
hormones yet to start forming that interest and the knowledge. So that's where the disconnect is in the criminal world because you can't connect a 4-year-old to a sexual intent. The conduct is driven with their own sexual desires because you don't expect a child to
interesting.
have that at that tender age. As the child gets older, it's different. And of course, as an adult, we all know that that is part of humanity, that there is a sexual desire and certain conduct we can connect with a sexual intent. But we don't have that connection with children. We don't have that normal understanding that children will do certain things to advance a sexual desire because they shouldn't have that desire at that age.
Interesting. So even things like, like what you were saying, like taking them to the bathroom or waiting till an adult leaves, you don't feel like that would, or that doesn't fall under that category of like that intent or almost like preparing, planning, to a certain degree.
Well, it's different though, because the law requires that you're doing these acts to further your own personal sexual desires, to advance your sexual desires. But
Got it.
nobody really has that connection that a 4-year-old has any sexual desires. They're committing that act. They're doing it because maybe they saw it and they're curious about doing
Yeah,
it. So the act is being committed, and the person it's committed against
got
is
it.
having the same effect of being sexually abused as whether it's a child or an adult. The effect is the same on that child. Maybe not exactly the same. It's obviously a lot probably worse when it's adult because
Yeah,
there's a lot more fear from a child,
yeah,
but they're still feeling the same effects of a sexual abuse. But the reasons why that child, that 4-year-old, 5-year-old is doing it is very different than what that 20-year-old.
uh,
The desires behind it are very different for that 20-year-old than it is for
yeah,
that 6-year-old. But that's where the big question that I have is, why are there so many more of these children doing these things?
yeah,
Where have they seen oral sex? Why does a 5-year-old know anything about oral sex?
yeah,
Where have
yeah,
they seen that? Where they're now curious about trying to do it themselves, and sometimes using even force to commit that act. It's not because they have the hormones driving them to do this for sexual desire, so sexual pleasure. It's for other reasons. And that's where the disconnect is from the criminal law, is
yeah.
because it's not done for their own sexual pleasure. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe it's something else, but that's where the disconnect is with criminal law.
Well, what about with the ones that you and I were talking about earlier, where there's like assault, there's more than one person
Well, again,
involved?
yeah, and like my case where I have a 5-year-old who held down 7 other children, mostly girls,
Yeah,
but it did involve other boys as well. But there's touching that's occurring. But
yeah.
again, for 5-year-olds,
Wow.
I'm sure to put on all the experts out there, no one's going to probably testify and say that that 5-year-old's conduct was driven for their own sexual pleasure. Because you don't have the chemicals, the hormones yet formed for a 5-year-old to have any form of sexual pleasure. So why are they doing it? They're doing it because either they're exposed to it somewhere. I don't know why they
Yeah,
got exposed to it,
got
whether
it.
it's the internet, whether it's a book, whether they're being sexually abused and they just now believe this is normal conduct and they're just
Ridiculous.
recreating what they're experiencing. But the problem and the core issue is we have to figure out where that child learned that from. And
Yeah,
if it is being exposure through social media or through the internet, then obviously we have a bigger societal problems that we have to
yes.
start cutting that off. And children shouldn't have that exposure because it is leading to this kind of conduct where now they're perpetuating that same conduct on other children. And it just gets worse and worse, and you get that snowball effect.
Mm. So many things to consider, and I can almost feel the frustration of a parent, that this could potentially happen too, that like, yeah, so many
Yeah, I
things
mean,
to
because as a
consider.
parent, I'm a parent.
Yeah,
We do everything to protect that child against that awful adult. We don't let them have sleepovers, away from
yes,
strangers. But then we
yeah,
send them to school, and the last thing we think about is that another child their age is going to harm them. And
yeah,
that's not something that we as parents have prepared ourselves or, have gotten ready defensively in our minds that this is even a possibility. We do
yeah,
all these things to protect our child against sexual abuse from an adult, but we don't ever think about the exposure that they're getting to other children. And that's the bigger societal problem is these children are clearly getting it from somewhere. Where are they
yeah,
getting it from? We need to cut that off, whether again it's internet, social media, overexposure to pornography. I don't know what it is.
yeah,
It's certainly, I don't think it's an increase in children being abused than in the past. So because I think these numbers are growing and escalating, there's a different place where these children are learning this from, and we need to
yeah.
figure that out and stop that because the effects are that they're going into the schools and hurting other children.
I would agree with that. I would agree, but we're out of time, Sam. It's always a good conversation. It just flies by with you and I. Um,
I
can you
appreciate
tell?
it, and I thank you. It's
Yeah.
It's an important conversation that I think we need
Absolutely.
to have that people aren't having, and I'm sure parents aren't even considering when they send their child to
No.
school that there is that danger and that potential exposure.
Yeah, I would agree. I've done some social media posts on this in the past that have gone viral because this is, for a lot of people, this is their first time hearing about it, and they never would have thought like youngsters, kiddos, toddlers, just a child would even do
Yeah,
that. And so it
yeah.
happens. So, tell people where they can find you. If you're working on anything we can support you with, happy to do so.
Yeah, come and check out our webpage, dlawgroup.com. It's D as in Dordulian, my last name, just the letter D and the word law group, dlawgroup.com. We have a lot of resources about all of these issues on our sexual assault page. And then you can call 1-888-GO-SEE-SAM, call us, you can obviously consult with any parents on any of these issues. Our local number is 818-788-4919 as well.
Love it. And I'll definitely put your website and everything in the show notes as before. And I thank you so much for coming on and educating everyone about this.
Thank you very much for having me and giving, me an opportunity to talk about this, what I think is an important issue for all parents to know about.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thank you.